Welcome to Here is Where We Meet, an original podcast series produced by Tank.
I'm Michael Morris.
And I'm James Lingwood, and you're listening to Here is Where We Meet, a series of conversations with just a few of the artists we worked with across 3 decades as co-directors of Artangel, producing extraordinary art in particular places across London, the UK, and beyond.
Today we're joined by artist and composer Heiner Goebbels to reflect on Stifter's Dinge, his performance with no performers. Made in collaboration with designer Klaus Grunberg, produced by Artangel in 2008, and sited in a former concrete testing facility underneath the Marylebone Road in central London. Let's begin by listening to a short extract.
There is an unfolding story in Stifter's Dinge. You know, that would you not?
You have to tell me.
Well, I experienced it as an unfolding story of humankind's relationship to its environment, you know, which was introduced by this writer called Adalbert Stifter. That's the Stifter of Stifter's Dinge, and I think Dinge is things or stuff. Or, at a point relatively early in the piece, you know, his voice or a reader of his writing guides the listener into this winter landscape, and there's this astonishment of this the ice on sounds on the trees, and then you integrate various fragments of texts and sounds, and those texts are to do with, sometimes more explicitly than others, but to do with the way humankind has exploited the environment.
I have to disappoint you very much. First of all, Stifter was the last one to join us in this work. He wasn't. I didn't have a title for a long time, and then maybe in the last 3 weeks or something, I reminded this thing and then included the text, and we named it Stifter's Dinge, because in the writing of Adalbert Stifter, exactly the things. No, he names things, all the things he doesn't know, all the things he has no proper relationship with or anything. So this is the first disappointment. The other one is that if somebody would have asked me to make a piece on climate change, I would say, you'd rather be a journalist. We had nothing like this, neither the ethnographic nor the ecologic dimensions of this piece in mind when we started. Our starting point, Klaus and me, was that we discovered in other places, in Oublier le démarquement des Astreux, and in Eraritiaka very much, and even in Max Black, these 3 pieces I was able to do with André Wilms, that at those moments when things on stage became the most driving force, or when even the performer, the actor, disappeared behind the set of Magdalena Jetelova in Oublier le démarquement des Astreux, or when he disappeared in Eraritiaka, when he left the stage actually and he went outside on the street, that those moments were the ones where the audience was most attentive. We noticed that. I always used to be with my performances close to the audience, and I noticed this was the most awake moment when André Wilms left the stage, because everybody was excited. What's going on? What's going on? There was also a little bit relieved because he had shouted at them before in a big monologue like a real actor. It was the only moment, as classical theater before. And so Klaus and me, we said, can we do, from these experiences, can we make a piece without anyone? And that was the starting point. I didn't think about nature and climate, and also not on this ethnological dimension. Then we started with one pool and one piano, two pianos. And then I think the elements and the materials, this lonesome playing piano, the dripping water in the pools, they made me use those texts, those sources.
But the performance with no performers isn't quite that, because there were technicians visible who played a role, actually.
Only the first 5 minutes.
Yeah, but we remembered them and then they disappeared.
Yeah.
And somehow the performance with no performers implies a landscape without humans, which does give us a sense of extinction of some kind.
Yeah.
Whether you intended it or not.
Exactly.
It doesn't really matter, because it fills us up with thoughts, emotions, feelings of absence.
For me, it matters because I think I existentially need this unintentional energy and source and surprise and partnership in the work, because I totally mistrust my conscious, let's say, theoretical way of dealing with things.
But that's the nature of your exploration. You do it in order to be surprised, in order to sort of think differently,
exactly,
and to prove that something that you didn't know before.
I had no idea how this piece would end when we started with this one pole. It was just, Klaus said, I would like to work with the water, when we said we want to do a piece without anybody. And I said, I would like to make a piece with the piano, because I knew how it works when it's remote controlled. That was the starting point, nothing else. No ideology on top.
So it's really like an explorer going on a journey, a little bit like Conrad in the Hapless Landing. That actually, is it difficult to bear not knowing where you're going?
Totally. It's totally difficult. You have sleepless nights and you think you're a loser and it will never be finished. Also, didn't start as a three-dimensional poem about the encounter with the other, as it was in the end. It started with Magdalena. I asked Magdalena Jetelova if I adored her installations, if she would be ready. She said, no, for theater, never. And then I convinced her, and she wanted to make a pool of water. I now remember. But it was too heavy for the stage in which we produced it in Paris. It would have killed the floor. And then she came up with the idea of the pyramid, and my idea was to work with André and with African musicians. When you have two African musicians and a French actor, and I started early with the text by Heiner Müller, then there's already some topics on the table which come by themselves.
You know, there is such an astonishing range of materials in your work. I mean, even if one thinks of the fragments of text, where are you drawing them from? Are you reading as you're working, or?
Sometimes I look at my library and then I pick up a book and I find something. I have no systematic way of storing quotes or ideas.
I mean, what it means is, which is interesting for a producer or a presenter like Artangel was with you, to actually talk about the work very authoritatively before it exists. Because actually, you should go not expecting anything, but you can't do that, because practically speaking, you have to get an audience by using some kind of language which inspires them to attend.
It's a huge problem. I think.
But
Because
in both occasions, when we worked together on Stifter's Dinge and later in 2018 on everything that happened and would happen, we were in the position where we had to, some months before, write about what the piece would be. We had no idea.
yeah, but you made me believe that we could work with the text by Patrick Goretnik. It was you.
A Europeana, because that
yeah.
was the starting point.
That was the starting point.
That was a very clear starting point.
Yes, that's your fault. And
It might be worth saying what the text of Europeana.
Well, Patrick Goretnik wrote a kind of a brief history of Europe over the 100 years of the 20th century. We chose this First World War as a starting point because we'd been invited by 1418 Now, which was an organization set up to mark the anniversary of the First World War. So we began with Goretnik's paragraphs or short extracts about the First World War. But really, his history was not in sequence. There was no kind of logic to it. And it's very funny.
for me, Patrick Goretnik is a grandchild of Gertrude Stein in a way, because he comes from being a translator for experimental literature, American literature. What he does is super clever. It's like in the making of Americans by Gertrude Stein. She always starts a chapter with a concrete image, and he always starts a chapter with the First World War, and then he very quickly he shifts away into the end of the 20th century or in it completely different. So he distracts you permanently. And my problem was a little bit that I never had worked with such a direct political text in the 20th or 21st century.
But there was never a thought that the job that you were doing was adapting the text. It was using it as a material. And then I think quite soon after, the idea of the object from your production of John Cage's Your Operas, the sets and the props were also a material which was deployed in this piece, as was the unedited no comment of Euronews. So there's three elements where we're in counterpoint. They were the kind of backbone of. So
three materials which I can interplay with each other. And I was a fan of Euronews, no comment, since the 90s. I already wrote texts about it because I thought this is the only way TV makes sense to me. And since I had staged the Europeras, and this was such an amount of wonderful stage designs, props by Klaus Grünberg, I thought it's a shame to throw that all away. Was not a new move. I remember that I did Eisler Material. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Yeah, that's all modern. I did that with a set design of black on white. So I used it twice with Jean Kallmann as a light designer. And
it's a sort of form of recycling, really.
It makes totally sense, because then you have also a starting point. You don't have to invent, you find it. And this idea of finding things and bringing them in a new context, into a new dimension of understanding or imagination, this is something which is probably for me quite
the other
crucial.
Important element, which was also lent to us by Cage, was the chance operation, which was the guiding principle in quite a lot of the work you made for the 17 performers who made up everything that happened. I remember watching the rehearsals and seeing them build things, but in real time.
Yes. And they still do.
Do pieces like Stifter's Dinge and other ones of yours, do they now have a life of their own without you being directly involved in their presentation?
It doesn't exist anymore. Théâtre Vidé has let them rust. They're rust.
Right. So they're
destroyed.
That has brought Stifter's Dinge to a close.
Yes, unfortunately. I think it was a piece of art. They should have taken care of it, but they didn't.
Would it be possible to do a retrospective of your work?
If Théâtre Vidé has still the drawings, it would be possible. the director of Teatro Viti, René González, he was a very traditional theater director, but he was also curious and open. And whenever I proposed him a piece, he said, no, I don't think we can do that. I remember that when we did Hashirigaki, he said, no, one coming from Canada, one coming from Japan, one performer from Stockholm, this is not, we can't handle it. And we had hundreds of shows all over the world. So it worked. And I convinced him. When we did Stifter's Dinge also, he said, no, nobody will come. Yeah? And there's no, because his idea of theater is a great identity, is mirroring yourself as an audience with a protagonist on stage. And then he said, then I said, give me 1 week and I'll show you something, how it might. And then he saw it after 1 week, a very first tryout, and he agreed. And this was always like this. Also with Eraritya Rityaka, when I said, we want to make a piece where the actor goes out of the theater, he was very afraid. But then I said, come on, give me a week, and we tried something out, and he was already blown away. He was very open for this, and it was a great.
It seemed like a kind of dance between you that he had to resist,
yeah,
in order to make you kind of persuade him.
Yes, exactly.
Which is actually
nice.
Quite touching, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it does show that it's important to have an institutional backup.
Yeah.
When you're an independent maker.
I showed you some videos of my recent work, which we did in a steel factory in Saarland. And you looked at it and said, it looks a little bit like a cousin, Stifter's cousin, because it's also a big machine. And we did the same process. I asked actually for 1 day, fully equipped tryout in the steel factory, and showed it to the general director. And 1 year before. And he said, yes, this looks very promising, and we're going to do that. I think it's also a way for me that something becomes more than just a concept, which I don't trust.
Are you drawn to these industrial or post-industrial sites because of the spaces that they offer you, or because they somehow also they are a certain kind of history?
Yes, I'm drawn to it. I think it has to do with the fact that those spaces, they're not made for representation. I mean, opera houses, opera stages, theater stages, they're made for representation. They're not made for something real. And when you have a real space, it doesn't forgive, it doesn't pardon you if you pretend. Pretending in an industrial space, making traditional theater in an industrial space, I think it's it doesn't work. On the other hand, an industrial space, the reality of the space, the history, whatever history it is, the functionality, it asks for different seriousness, of different impact, which can compete with the reality of the space. And an opera stage doesn't. You have to be just a good singer, whatever you sing, that's fine. I think what other directors later and earlier did, that they just built classical stages inside the industrial halls, I think it's ridiculous, completely ridiculous. They have so much more to give, and you have to deal with it. You have to compete with it, and then it makes you stronger.
Or collaborate with it, and you have to use it as a material.
Yeah, you have to collaborate with the material as well, which can be also the smell. It's a light. It's the dust.
The pigeons, in the case of Manchester.
Oh my goodness!
Mayfield Depot.
It was the coldest, dirtiest, most boomy, reverberant space.
It really had.
But it helped the piece.
It did help the piece, but I think it didn't help the health of the participants.
Oh, we were all stronger. Later we were stronger than before.
More antibodies.
We had to be.
Historians said, but other historians said, and yet others said. Some people said, but the Germans said, and the Russians said, while the French said, scientists said, and astrophysicists said, believers said, and some scientists said.
Some Orthodox priests said,
women said,
the postcards said,
and some
historians said, and some historians said,
sociologists
and other historians said,
Christians
and the pacifists said, some philosophers said, and some mathematicians said, and politicians and public relations experts said.
I think, when you talk about luck and not having a plan, I mean, that reflects James and I in the last 30 years as well. We never had a plan. And we enjoyed a lot of freedom, and you've enjoyed a lot of freedom. We're privileged to have enjoyed a lot of freedom. But I think freedom is also a state of mind, and luck is something you make for yourself as well.
Yeah, I mean, you created a form of curating works and making them possible and showing them, which I don't think has existed before. I mean, that you had no institutionalized, and that you were fighting against institutionalization on all levels. Somehow we have, at least from the beginning, we had this mistrust in institutionalization. We had it in common, because I was unable to work in opera houses or in repertoire theaters, because they could not accept this open way of creation. They could just simply not deal with it, not deal with the timetable. And you're right. So we deserve the luck, you mean.
Do you think this mistrust of institutions also, in your case, was a mistrust of genres? That, a genre was a container.
Yeah. The institution is producing the containers. Yeah. This is
the institution and the funding system is compartmentalized. You have to declare what you are, who you're doing, what the budget is, what material is, far too early in institutional settings.
Yeah, but I think for performing arts, and it is even worse, because I mean we have a rich oeuvre of operas and theater plays in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, they were building this huge, I mean, I'm speaking about Germany. Maybe it's not different, this will be different here. These huge opera houses and theater houses. And then they created teaching programs to provide the next personnel who can do what is expected on stage. So for example, the education for theater was never meant to be experimental or open or free. It was always training for the next main role in a Shakespeare play or in a Wagner opera or whatever, a dance piece. So that was the luck of the institution of the institute, let's call it institute, in which I was working as a professor, is that for a long time this was the only institute which said we are not building the performer of the future of the institutionalized theater. We are building an institute in which the next art forms can be developed. Yeah.
Do you think it's become easier to maintain your independence of institutional settings, or is it becoming more difficult now?
More difficult.
Why, in particular, more difficult?
Right now I have no house, for example. That's why I'm not producing.
Because the Vidi was such an important collaborator.
Yes, and it was, with the death of René González, it was the end for me. I could not work in a German repertoire house, definitely not. And they could not even, I mean, they always ask me, but then I say, yes, but can I bring the performers? No, you have to work with the ensemble, of course.
For 3 years, between 2012 and 2014, you were on the other side of the fence. You were the director of the Ruhr Triennale. You were producing and commissioning.
True, I forgot.
you were producing and commissioning. Mm-hmm. And how did it feel to be in that position where you were enabling people to do things?
I think I've learned of you before I did that. I learned of you, and I spoke with you a lot also. Yeah. And you came, and you were frozen. You were freezing in the winter. I think my experience with going through the long way to create Stifter's Dinge in London was very helpful. Well, my first, also my own principles, of course, I invited all the artists whom I wanted to produce something to come to the Ruhr at least 1 year ahead. I showed them all the spaces. That's what I learned from you. and then let them choose. I didn't produce any piece of the repertoire. I almost did no theater in the 3 years, because I thought myself, we have 250 state theaters in Germany, we have 80 opera houses. I don't want to do anything which they can do. And all my successors, they do this. They do it like before. They co-produce with the theater houses or new ways of doing the old repertoire.
I mean, it gave us an opportunity as well to re-explore Stifter's Dinge with the unguided tour, which was the kind where we expanded the landscape. There was no auditorium. The visitor was part of the landscape of Stifter's Dinge. It was an expanded version, which we did in the Ruhr and then in London again. But it's a very unusual opportunity to revisit something like that.
But Michael, do you remember the early rehearsal you saw in VD? Mm-hmm. And you didn't want to stay with us on the stand where the sound designer and the video designer and the technical robotics are controlled, and with the director. You were going through the space. And then you said at one, I remember where you were standing actually, on the left side and the second column or something. Then I said, oh, it's also nice from here. And maybe you should. And that was a moment when we seriously thought of maybe doing Stifter's Dinge from the beginning as an open installation.
I'd forgotten that, and now I remember that moment.
I think we together we said no, let's not do it, but it came back in 2012 when we.
Yeah, and that was a very different experience, because the visitor was able to look very closely at the material and to choose what they focused on.
But the same image I just recalled, you standing at the side and then proposing of questioning the directional version. I also remember that my argument against was that immediately I was looking at your reaction, and I wasn't looking at the pianos anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's why I loved the focus on because a human body inside is somehow it attracts us much stronger than an old piano.
Well, it's no longer a performance with no performers.
Yeah.
And
right.
you have much more control if you have an auditorium and you're actually watching an image which was composed. I mean, all the images in Stifter's Dinge in the original version were compositions, mm-hmm. whereas the exploded version didn't feel quite as integrated. But a lot of people who never saw the original version got a lot out of and you could stay for as long as you wanted, whereas I think the original version was 90 minutes.
No,
less.
60.
But at the end of the version, which had a seated audience, and it was very frontal, as you say, so it was quite a long rectangular space. Am I right in remembering that then the audience were invited to come down?
Yes, to inspect
and
it.
to as this sort of very slow bubbling sort of ending, a bubbling of the liquid in the pools, that you were invited to sort of wander around. Mm-hmm. And I think that, so in a sense the ending for those people was when they decided to walk out of the space. You know, you didn't really say, look, this is what it was.
No, they used the chance.
Yeah.
They used the chance a lot, yes. Everywhere. I mean, it was yeah, so you see, I always try to avoid knowing what I'm doing, but in the end, of course, I want to have a trustful result, or a result which is open enough to keep the imagination of the audience busy, and which is not closing up things into one meaning.
How does that work when you're actually on your own writing a score for an orchestra as a composer? Because you have written, although they're not simply pieces of music, there's other elements in them, but you have to compose the music.
But music is never meaning. Music can be interpreted in different ways. And I think we could take this conversation on another level, saying that I try to do theater as I do music, in the way that we try to develop a language which is not meant to be meant to make messages. And this is something we can learn from music, and that's why you find in my visual music theater plays these musical elements even in the visuals, like what I described with the 3 pulls instead of 1, or with the lighting, with the rhythm of lighting, with the musicality of speech, with André Wilms. These are all elements to look for the musicality in theater, or to make theater as a piece of music.
Here is Where We Meet is devised by James Lingwood and Michael Morris, co-directors of Artangel from 1991 to 2023. The theme is composed by P.J. Harvey. Millie Roberts is the production manager, and Matteo Pini is the editor. Nell Whitaker, Sorab Golsorki-Ainsley, and Thomas Ruche are executive producers. Otomi Larcher is the graphic designer, and Stephen Lewin is the audio engineer. Here is Where We Meet is an original podcast by Tank and is available on all good podcast platforms. The series is dedicated to the memory of John Berger, from whose book of imaginary conversations its title is taken.